I'm conscious of the time, and I'm particularly and vividly conscious of the fact that I'm standing between all of you and your lunch, which is a very precarious place to stand, so I better get started. This is a paper about disagreement. More specifically, it's a paper about what rationality does or doesn't require when we find ourselves in certain sorts of disagreements. Now, as you all know, philosophy is rife with disagreement, isn't it? It's perennial in the history of philosophy, it's pervasive in contemporary philosophy, and it sometimes even comes up in our department meetings. And I don't think it's some kind of rhetorical overstatement to say that disagreement is this really important feature of the human condition that has lots of ramifications for all aspects of life. So I think it's important to think about disagreement a little bit. And I should thank, he's not here, but I should thank Kirk Lougheed, who did a major research paper with me last year on this topic and really got me, in fact, we had a disagreement. He got me thinking about this, but we had a disagreement about a particular view that you'll hear about in a few minutes due to Catherine Elgin. Kirk was much more attracted to this view than I was. I didn't really think it was going to work. But he wore down my resistance to it over the year, and so as you'll see, a chunk of this paper is actually going to be to attempt to defend Catherine Elgin's view against a number of objections. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to set up a little bit of an introduction about the contemporary debate about the epistemology of disagreement. Someone told me that in the past decade or so, there have been about 300 papers published on this particular topic, which is a truly formidable output of research. I'm going to say a little bit about a couple of new proposals that attempt to broaden the scope of this debate. I'm friendly to both of them, and I'm going to try to take, I think, the best parts of both of them and stick them together. The debate, I think, has been a little bit narrow, and this is a good move to try to broaden it. Then I'm going to set up Catherine Elgin's view, which I call community-oriented anti-revisionism. And I'm going to set out and try to defend it against 7 objections and then wrap up. Okay. So the first 2 cases are quite common in this literature. Suppose that we're at lunch, right, and we're adding up the bill, and we come to different totals, right? So I've got my total and you've got your total, and they're different. It seems as though, many people will say, once we learn that there's a disagreement about this business of basic arithmetic, perhaps we should both be inclined to reduce our confidence in our original view that we had the sum correct, right? There's a certain instinct there. Perhaps that's how we behave from time to time. Or suppose we're at a horse race and we find ourselves in a disagreement about which horse was the winner, right? So I thought that horse A won and you thought that horse B won. Upon coming to learn that you think differently from me, perhaps, so the argument goes, I should be a little less confident in my original judgment. Now there have to be some conditions in place. Perhaps I need to know that you're not drunk or otherwise addled in your perceptual mechanisms and so forth. In the restaurant case, I suppose I need to know that you're just about as good at basic arithmetic as me and so forth. Or suppose you're about to, submit your paper to a journal, right? You're about to hit the send button on the email. And your very bright colleague bursts into your office and says, wait, I have an objection for you to consider, And you think your colleague is really smart, perhaps just as smart as you. And so you might think to yourself, now that I know, or I've come to learn that my colleague disagrees with me about, this claim P in my paper, what should I do? Maybe I'm not going to click send right away. I'm going to reevaluate it, or maybe I'm going to be less confident that my argument was really right concerning P or what have you. Okay? The first case, obviously, a case of basic arithmetic. The second one is perceptual. Third one is much more complex, right? It involves this whole array of philosophical judgments and inferences. But there's this kind of instinct common to all 3 cases, a sort of tendency that we might think that we ought to revise our confidence upon coming to learn that somebody disagrees with us. Not just anybody. So a revisionist is someone who thinks, as the name suggests, that you ought to revise your view in the face of disagreement. An anti-revisionist is someone who thinks that you're not always obliged to revise your view in the face of disagreement. But what kind of disagreement? Well, most of the discussion has been about acknowledged epistemic peers. Okay, so let me say a little bit about what those words are typically taken to mean. Jennifer Lackey, in a survey paper, says this: 2 people are epistemic peers with respect to some issue when they're roughly evidential and cognitive equals. That is, when they're roughly equally familiar with the evidence and arguments that bear on the question and are at least roughly, so far as we can tell, we might add, equally competent, intelligent, and fair-minded in their assessment of it. Those people would be epistemic peers. And what does it mean to be an acknowledged epistemic peer? Well, David Christensen says this: A lot of the recent discussion has centered on the special case in which someone forms some opinion on P, then discovers that some other person has formed an opposite opinion, excuse me, where one has good reason to believe that the other person is at least approximately one's equal in terms of, and here we get into the notion of epistemic peerhood. So it's the awareness of disagreement. Much of this literature has been about epistemic peers, and once the disagreement is made obvious to you, as indeed it was in the 3 cases that I mentioned. Okay, so the disagreement is known to you, and you acknowledge that the other person is an epistemic peer. 2 recent proposals want to broaden the scope of this debate a little bit to concern more than just acknowledged epistemic peers. In a recent paper, she's actually talking about religious disagreement, but the issue is generalized to disagreement more generally. Jennifer Lackey offers this question, I call it the key question. She thinks the key question is this: what does rationality require when there's disagreement between those who do regard, and this is the new part, those who should regard one another as epistemic peers with respect to the question whether P? So maybe I don't know, maybe I don't in fact regard Andrew Hunter as my epistemic peer, but perhaps I should, right? And what Lackey wants to say, the force of this disagreement issue should come into play even when you should regard someone as an epistemic peer. It's sort of this contingent fact that maybe you're confused and you don't regard someone as an epistemic peer. If you should, then the issue is going to kick in, according to Lackey. So it's a kind of normative component that she wants to add. Okay, well, when are you justified in thinking that 2 people are equally justified? Very complex issue, of course, right? Lackey suggests a few things. And this gets close to the notion of epistemic peerhood, right? And under what conditions we would regard someone as epistemic peers. So both parties have been thinking about the subject matter for long enough and in enough detail. Both are sufficiently intellectually virtuous. Whatever the intellectual virtues are, they possess them to the same degree, or at least roughly the same degree. And neither solely possesses evidence that the other one would think decisive. Okay, a couple of quick comments here. I think she can probably just get rid of the business about whether you in fact do regard someone as an epistemic peer, right? Because you might in fact regard someone as an epistemic peer who you shouldn't regard to be an epistemic peer. I think she's right to focus on the normative issue, namely the people whom you should regard as epistemic peers. So we can just get rid of the first disjunct there. She seems to think, she doesn't say a whole lot about it, but it looks like she thinks that these conditions here are jointly sufficient. But I don't know, you might want to add a little bit more to it. I mean, I'm friendly to this, but you might want to add a bit more to it. You might want to say something about the caliber of evidence that each party here possesses, right? And my last point is this: there might be other conditions you want to add as well, I suppose, but as you think about this, you might be thinking, okay, well, this looks maybe like a very pure and rarefied philosophical issue when you've got all these conditions satisfied. You might think that it doesn't really happen very often that these kinds of pure peer disagreements arise. Maybe they're sometimes, but maybe they're not that common, right? So you might wonder, how common are disagreements when 2 parties can reasonably ascribe A, B, and C and whatever other conditions you want to add, not only to themselves, but to the other person as well, right? And indeed, that thought has been used to sort of limit the scope of the problem, right? The obvious problem to point ahead is this: if something like revisionism is true, the worry is that it's going to metastasize. It's going to become this uncontrollable skepticism that's going to make us rationally required to be, agnostic or rather less confident about everything that we believe, right? So one response to that is to say, yes, but this issue of sort of pure epistemic peers disagreeing with each other, that's this artificial thing. It doesn't happen very often, right? Lackey wants to broaden it a little bit by adding this normative component, but the more conditions like this you embed and the more robust you make them, the more you might think that the problem doesn't arise very often in the real world. Okay. And I think it is a problem in the real world. Nathan King comes at this a slightly different way, but his goal is the same. He wants to, again, to broaden the scope of this debate, right? To resist the thought that this is some philosophical artifice that doesn't happen very often in the real world. So Lackey, as I said, poses a kind of question. King, on the other hand, proposes a kind of answer, at least for the skeptic. It goes like this: if S believes P, and becomes aware that there's somebody else who believes not P, and S has no reason to think that her total epistemic position with respect to P makes her more likely to be right, that's the antecedent, consequent, then either S is irrational in believing P, or S doesn't know P. right? If you defend this conditional, there's a pretty skeptical conclusion, right? If you think the antecedent is pretty regularly satisfied. Just to contrast these two here, Lackey seems to be trying to target the presence of skepticism inducing reasons. King seems to want to target the absence of skepticism defeating reasons. So King's target is broader. I don't know how much turns on that really, but I think there's a useful contrast there. One thing I like about King's antecedent here is it doesn't just focus on epistemic peers, right? It's compatible with this antecedent that you should start to worry very much about a disagreement with your epistemic superior. Surely we, at least in some cases, have epistemic superiors. And maybe it's rational to stick to your guns sometimes in the face of disagreement with an epistemic superior, but, isn't there a tempting thought that we ought, at least sometimes, if not rather often, to defer to our epistemic superiors on issues in which they're superior, right? That's why we go to doctors and so forth, right? So I like that, right? I like that his antecedent focuses not only on peers, but also epistemic superiors. But I would like to add what I call Lackey's lesson here, right? This idea that we should not focus on the people whom you in fact regard as peers, but on the people who you ought to regard as peers. So I'd like to see that added here. This is all just stage setting. I'm trying to set up the debate as carefully as I can. As for his consequent, my own preference, this isn't really a knockdown, drag-out argument, but my only preference would be to make the consequent a bigger tent, right? I would say let's make the consequent basically revisionism, right? You should revise your confidence to some degree. Whether that makes you irrational or whether that undermines knowledge, who knows? We can argue about that later. But my thought is it'll be more useful for the debate if King's consequent is just revisionism, and then we can argue about the details later on. I think it'll capture more of the debate at any rate. Okay, so here's my suggestion. You can let me know if you think it works. So this is, again, just to set the terms of the debate. So I propose this. If S believes P and is aware of somebody else who believes not P, and S is either justified or at the very least epistemically inculpable in having no reason to think that she's more likely to be right, then S should reduce her confidence. Okay, that's just revisionism, right? So I've just changed the consequent there to say, look, you got to do something about it. You can't just stick to your guns. You've got to reduce your credence level. Whether that means you're no longer rational in holding P or whether that means you can never know P, we can argue about that later on. Okay, so I've tried, I don't know if it's clear, but I've tried in the first bit in yellow to include Lackey's lesson, right, adding this normative component. It's not just about who you do in fact regard as peers, but who you ought to regard as a peer. And as I say, I've tried to make the consequent a kind of big tent. So here and after, let's say that a revisionist is somebody who defends this claim, and of course an anti-revisionist is someone who wants to resist it. My focus is going to be in a few minutes talking about a particular argument for anti-revisionism. But first, just because I think it's really neat, I want to reflect for just one slide about the scope of this other subject, T. Right? In the restaurant case, or the horse race case, or the journal submission case, the other person is someone who's right before you, right? It's an actual person with whom you are contemporaneous, right? She's in your office saying, I've got a great objection to your paper. She's across the table from you saying, I have a different total with respect to the bill. But for my money anyway, I think the scope of this some other subject T could be rather broader. And other people think the same way. I'm not going to really argue for this, I'm just going to suggest it. So the debate, as I said, typically focuses on actual peers who are in the same, temporal moment as you. But, at least one person, Adam Elga, has this paper where he says, look, maybe you could reflect about your past self who thought differently. Your past self really was quite sure about P. Now, of course, you think that not P is the sober truth of the matter, but, your past self had some really excellent reasons for believing P, and maybe these reasons are even vivid to you. You can sort of add the story however you like, right? So it might be that you should be less confident in your current judgment merely on reflecting about how you used to think. This happens sometimes, doesn't it? I mean, we do this, right? Can this ever be rational, I guess, is the question. I'll go on to extend it in the other direction as well. Maybe your future self might come up with some really good counterarguments to the view that you currently hold. And if you think your future self, is an epistemic peer, or at least an epistemic peer, maybe that should give you some pause. You can probably see where this is going. Why not the self who you might have been? Right? Surely there's this radical contingency to many of the beliefs that we hold, right? This should come as no surprise. We've all reflected on it, and it can really be quite vertiginous when we reflect on it carefully, right? The number of utterly contingent factors that went into shaping the beliefs that we hold about mundane things, but also about the great questions of life and philosophy is really quite staggering, right? Terrific quote from John Stuart Mill, right? And the world to each, he sort of warms up to it, so you'll see where he's going. And the world to each individual means the part of it with which he comes in contact, his party, his sect, his church, his class of society. Nor is his faith in this collective authority at all shaken by his being aware that other ages, countries, sects, churches, classes, and parties have thought and even now think the exact reverse. It never troubles him that mere accident has decided which of these numerous worlds is the object of his reliance, and that the same causes which make him a churchman in London would have made him a Buddhist or a Confucian in Peking, right? This radical contingency of many of the beliefs that we hold, right? If you're tempted by that, so Mill's pointing out here, of course, that we're not normally bothered by that, but maybe in the philosophy room we ought to be a bit bothered by it. That's what the revisionists are going to say anyway. So maybe we should think about our counterfactual selves, right? Maybe reflection, to put it more specifically, maybe reflection on the fact that our counterfactual selves might be epistemic peers ought to make us less confident in our current actual judgment that P, right? Because our counterfactual selves might well have believed differently. Many of them do believe differently. There's a bit of literature on this. Well, and if a counterfactual self, why not also a counterfactual philosopher? For any argument that you give, for any conclusion P, it seems like there might have been a really good philosopher with a really good counterargument, right? And this thought, too, can be a little bit vertiginous, right? Some of you will remember Nathan Ballantyne gave a paper here a few years ago where he took this line, right? He worried really quite a bit about counterfactual philosophers. And the thought is in a seminal paper, in a rudimentary form anyway, by Richard Feldman. So for my money, and I'm not really defending this, I'm posing it for your thought. For my money, we should answer yes to all these questions. To restrict the scope of this problem to the present and the now and the actual is a little bit arbitrary and chauvinistic. That's just me. Okay, so revisionists want to defend this claim, SK star. And they do so in all sorts of ways, and I'm not going to run through all of them. One is, and I led with this, didn't I, the highly intuitive appeal of toy cases. When somebody else comes up with a different total in the restaurant bill than you do, we often, in fact, do revise our confidence in our initial judgment, right? Maybe we even think that we're rationally required to do that. That's the kind of intuition that revisionists will appeal to, right? I don't know, anti-revisionism can seem a little bit question-begging, right? It seems like it's a little bit, well, I don't have to change my view because after all my view is correct, but of course that's the very thing that's under dispute, so isn't there something a little bit question-begging about it? I won't talk about that one. And there are all sorts of anti-revisionist arguments, right? There are many more, I think, in the literature, anti-revisionist arguments than revisionist arguments. People have come up with all sorts of ways to try to resist the skeptical worry motivated by disagreement. One of them, that I don't think is very strong, is this. A lot of people say, well, look, revisionism is no good because it entails or licenses a kind of skepticism. And, well, we don't want that, do we? Right? If it has that consequence, it has that consequence. That's no reason in and of itself to reject it. I don't think this is typically a very strong strategy. You need some independent reason, I think, for thinking that skepticism is false. A more promising strategy, I think, though it's hotly debated, is that revisionism is itself undermining, right? Consider the revisionist thinks that in the case of disagreement with, let's say, acknowledged peers, one ought to revise one's view. She believes that to be correct. But of course there is dispute about that very issue. So can she really have a stable view? Should she not in fact revise away from revisionism, right? It looks like there's a kind of self-referential problem there. Other people will say, well, you know, I'm in these debates or disputes all the time. I understand the other person's reasons, they understand mine. Let's stipulate that we're epistemic peers and so forth. But nevertheless, maybe I just have some kind of special incommunicable insight or incommunicable intuition that my interlocutor lacks. Peter van Inwagen says this in a few places. Okay, there's a number of other, I could go on, there's a number of other anti-revisionist arguments. But I want to turn to a really different one that focuses on the social dimension of knowledge, and that's Catherine Elgin's community-oriented anti-revisionism. Okay. So, in an interesting paper, Elgin offers a different take on this. First of all, she says, look, a lot of this talk has been about belief, but of course many philosophers think that beliefs are involuntary. We need this other concept, acceptances. Acceptances are voluntary, whereas beliefs are involuntary. That's a distinction that comes up in Cohen and lots of other people. So what's an acceptance exactly? Well, here's what Elgin says. To accept that P is to adopt a policy of being willing to treat P as a premise in an assoteric inference or as a basis for action when our interests are cognitive. That's what she means by accepting P. Okay. Here's her argument. In a nutshell, she thinks that sticking to your guns in the face of known disagreement, at least sometimes, can benefit your epistemic community. And so maybe it's rationally permissible sometimes to stick to your guns, even though a smart person disagrees with you, for the sake of these down-the-road epistemic benefits for your community. She doesn't want to say this is always the case. And look at how many restrictions and qualifications are embedded here. When reasons favoring each side of a dispute are sparse or delicate, or the evidence is equivocal, or each side can solve important problems that the other can't, it may be better for the community, the epistemic community, that both positions continue to be accepted. Each group or each individual can then draw on a different range of commitments for premises in their reasoning and as a basis for their actions. By developing their positions, they put them to the test. Tolerance of disagreement is especially valuable only when disagreement among parties who have sufficient expertise, that their opinions are individually worth accepting, and she already said this, where the evidence is equivocal. When these conditions are met, a community of inquiry may best be served if epistemic peers resolutely reason and act on opinions about which other equally smart people disagree. In such cases, peers who disagree have reasons to consider each other wrong, but not irrational. Perhaps in the fullness of time, the disagreement will be resolved. That remains to be seen. So sometimes we should agree to disagree, consider the other person rational, not for our own sakes, but for the sake of this community of inquiry. So it's anti-revisionism, right? It's saying that it's not always the case that you're rationally required to revise. And I call it community-oriented revisionism because it focuses on this social dimension, the epistemic community. So she doesn't actually adduce some of the evidence for this, but there actually is some evidence, I think, for the claim that some kinds of epistemic diversity really do help communities of inquirers get to the truth, right? There's actually a lot of empirical research showing that groups that are cognitively diverse in various ways outperform homogeneous groups and outperform individuals, at least in certain kinds of tasks, in problem-solving tasks and in predictive tasks. Cognitively diverse, what does that mean? Well, I suppose it could mean lots of different things. But perhaps one thing it might mean is that there are lots of different positions being held, right? That seems like it might be one kind of cognitive diversity. To really harness the power of this empirical evidence, you'd have to argue that that is in fact an appropriate kind of cognitive diversity that could lead to these benefits. But there's something suggestive here, right? So the idea is this, and philosophers of science, I don't know this literature very well, but philosophers of science have had a lot to say about this, right? That groups can benefit from the division of cognitive labor, and one way to divide the cognitive labor, well, one way is to set up a bunch of different labs that pursue different lines of inquiry on a common question, right? Maybe science is best served in that way. But maybe you can tell the story in the following way. Maybe one way to do division of cognitive labor is by having different labs or communities or individuals start with different acceptances, right? And maybe that will lead the community as a whole just a little bit closer, or maybe more quickly, to the truth, right? There's actually, should I say this? There's actually something else that's relevant here. There's a theory of rationality, a theory of reasoning called the argumentative theory of reasoning, which runs as follows. The evolutionary point of reasoning was not to gain access to unalloyed truth. It was to win arguments, right? That's the evolutionary utility of reasoning, right? So goes this theory. Maybe it's also the case that gaining access to unalloyed truth is useful, but it's certainly useful in evolutionary terms to win arguments, right? That thought seems pretty familiar. And within this theory, actually, there's a kind of attempt, interesting to me because I teach critical thinking all the time, there's an attempt to kind of rehabilitate cognitive bias. So we always teach our students, right, it's a terrible thing to be unduly influenced by arguments or considerations that support the view you antecedently hold. But people who defend this argumentative theory of reasoning say that cognitive bias can actually be useful for communities in an evolutionary sense, right? Because you've got these different individuals, right, in the marketplace of ideas, who are seeking out confirmation for their own views, and maybe somehow or other that's going to benefit the community as a whole, right? Remember what Elgin said, by testing, each side puts the other's arguments to the test better by remaining steadfast. Okay. These are all controversial points, of course. And I should mention, right, these are meant to be descriptive claims. This is meant to be a theory of reasoning, an evolutionary theory of reasoning, and this is meant to be some claims about the way science proceeds, But of course, Elgin's view is supposed to be a normative, right? She's saying that it's not the case that you're always rationally required to revise in the face of disagreement. Okay. A few objections to Elgin's view. Maybe I won't do them all. So Christensen, although it predates Elgin, he mentions a view like this, and he says, well, look, the problem with this view is that it's going to license irrationally high levels of confidence. And that's about all that he says. And I think that in the form that he says it, it's really a kind of question begging against Elgin's proposal, right? Elgin wants to establish the very claim that it can sometimes be rational to stick to your guns in the face of disagreement. So to simply stipulate at the outset that this is irrational seems like a kind of question begging. So I think we can set that one aside. On the other hand, it looks, if you read the slide carefully that I read the passage from when Elgin set out her view, it looks like maybe she has something infelicitous there. It might look like she begs the question because she stipulates in her statement of the argument that each side's opinion is individually worth accepting. But that, of course, is supposed to be the conclusion, right? That that you're entitled to accept them or something like that. There's an easy fix for that, though, right? I think what she just needs to say is that each view is prima facie worth accepting, or independently of knowing about the disagreement, each side meets a minimum threshold of epistemic worth, or something like that. I think there's a way to fix that. I don't think she can be found guilty of question begging here. Now, maybe you're kind of on board with this idea, right? That maybe sometimes it's okay for me to stick to my guns for the sake of the community. But then you might be thinking, yeah, okay, fine, but what I really want is a sort of a roadmap. I want to know in my daily affairs or my philosophical inquiry, when do I stick to my guns when smart people disagree with me, and when do I roll over, right? But I think that's actually an unfair demand, right? Elgin's not in the business of giving us a detailed epistemic roadmap or list of rules. She's merely trying to establish that it's false, that reason always requires you to revise in the face of disagreement. That's all she's trying to do. So to demand this is to make, I think, an unreasonable demand of her position. Yeah, but I don't know, isn't it going to promote dogmatism or acrimony or something odious, right? This sort of licensing to stick to your guns, isn't that what, got us into various messes in society? I don't know. I mean, I don't know exactly what dogmatism is. Maybe it's more than just holding an unpopular view. It's holding an unpopular view with too much confidence, right? Maybe an irrational kind of confidence, but then it just collapses into this, and I already argued against that one. So I'm not sure about that. And, promoting acrimony, well, maybe it will or maybe it won't, but that has nothing to do with the merits or demerits of the position, right? It doesn't show a position to be false that it promotes acrimony. Perhaps lots of true positions promote acrimony. So I don't think that that's a terribly strong objection either. Well, maybe you're attracted to Elgin's view just a little bit, and maybe you think to yourself like this, okay, sure, maybe sometimes it's okay for me to stick to my guns in the face of disagreement so that my community will benefit. But then you might think to yourself, look, here's the thing. I care about whether my community in some unspecified point in the future gets to the truth. But what I really care about is getting to the truth for me, right? What I really want to know is whether P, right? That's what I care about. I don't care so much about this community stuff, these benefits down the road, right? So does it somehow illicitly or objectionably suborn your individual interest to group needs? My quick reply would be this. My quick reply would be that Elgin's view actually isn't demanding anything of you. So you can't say that it's making an illicit demand. It's demanding nothing of you whatsoever. The logic of it is that it's giving you permission to remain steadfast, but giving you permission is not the same as making a demand. I think that might be enough. I'm not completely sure. I think that might be enough to stop objection 5 in its tracks. I'll skip 6. We can maybe talk about it later if you want. And let me turn a little bit to 7. I think maybe this one's more promising, so I want to say just a little bit more about it. This is where we get into the nitty-gritty of how this is supposed to work. So when do you stay steadfast and when do you revise in the face of disagreement? What principles do we follow, right? I've already said it's illegitimate to demand a perfect roadmap through life from Catherine Elgin in one short paper. That's not fair. But can we say a little bit more about in what cases we should revise and in what cases we should remain steadfast? Okay, here's a few alternatives. This is not yet the objection. This is the setup for the objection. Suppose you have no beliefs or no acceptances at all about whether sticking to your guns in this case is going to lead to benefits to the community. You have no beliefs about it whatsoever. It doesn't seem like Elgin's view can kick in that case, right? If you have no beliefs whatsoever about whether your community will benefit from your sticking to your guns on this occasion, it doesn't seem like you should have any license to stick to your guns, right? So notice this all things considered clause here. And it's not just any old epistemic benefit. Perhaps I should have said this earlier, right? It seems like if you're going to stick to your guns in the face of disagreement, for the sake of your community benefiting down the road, I don't know, it probably should be a good enough benefit, right? It can't be some sort of microscopic advance that happens 100 years later because you chose to remain steadfast on Tuesday, right? You'd want to say that there should be adequate epistemic benefits. I mean, I think Elgin should want to say that anyway. Okay, so my point really, though, is this. You've got to have some beliefs about the likelihood of there being benefits. Then, I think, and only then, is the license to remain steadfast going to kick in for Elgin's view. So it's not going to do to be totally agnostic about whether there will be benefits for your community. Surely it's not going to be the case that you're entitled to stay steadfast when you think it's unlikely that your remaining steadfast will lead to benefits down the road, right? You can see where this is going, right? It's got to be this, right? I think Elgin's view can only kick in if you believe or perhaps accept that it's likely that, and then we move to here, that it's likely that, all things considered, sticking to your guns concerning P for some time will lead to adequate epistemic benefits. It's got to be in that case that you're given the license by Elgin to stick to your guns, right? So here comes the objection. All right, well, if it's ever okay, and by okay I mean rational, if it's ever rational to stick to your guns about P in the face of disagreement, you've got to be in position E. And you've got to rationally be in position E. But how on earth could you ever be rational in thinking that it's likely that, all things considered, your staying steadfast about some issue for some time is going to lead to adequate epistemic benefits? How could you ever know such a thing like that? Right here, a kind of skepticism is being used against this anti-skeptical argument. How could you ever know something like that? How could you ever be reasonable in believing that, is what I should say. Well, here's a suggestion, a friendly suggestion for Elgin. Maybe what she could do is say that condition E, as I've set it out, I was just defending it a minute ago, but maybe it's actually too strict, right? So here's condition F, which is obviously more modest, right? Maybe Elgin's license is only going to kick in the following case. F. S has got to reasonably believe or accept that her remaining steadfast about P for some time is, given the relevant evidence that she can reasonably expected to acquire, likely to lead to these benefits. So I've replaced this very strong, all things considered judgment condition rather, with the much more mild italicized one here in yellow, right? Given the relevant evidence that she can reasonably be expected to acquire. So maybe that's a better requirement. And if so, then she can argue that this requirement is at least sometimes met, and of course that's all that she needs. Well, she needs a bit more than that, but right, she's trying to, let me situate the dialectic here, right? She's trying to respond to revisionism. Revisionists say that you should always revise in the face of disagreement. She's trying to say it's not true that you should always revise in the face of disagreement. On at least some occasions, you can remain steadfast in your view when you meet condition F, right? So if that's going to work, then she will have defeated revisionism. And that's all she ever set out to do. Okay. Well, you know, this is philosophy, right? The work is never done. Maybe I'm anticipating some points that you're already thinking of here. I think if she welcomes this proposal, someone might still say, well, look, a lot more work is needed to flesh it out, right? After all, what exactly counts as evidence relevant to the question of whether epistemic benefits are going to accrue to your community down the road in virtue of your remaining steadfast today and for some time, right? That seems like a good question to ask. What kind of evidence of that sort can you reasonably be expected to acquire? That phrase appeared in condition F as well. So, you know, what does that mean anyway? We might wonder or want some more clarification on that. Do you have to recognize it as evidence and understand something about its evidential force, or is it sufficient to merely possess it without recognizing its evidential force? There's a kind of internalism, externalism debate here, perhaps. And you were probably thinking this as I ran through it. I sort of said hastily in passing, well, you know, the benefits have to be good enough. They can't just be these microscopic benefits. And so you might say, okay, well, if we're really going to take this proposal seriously, what exactly is the minimum epistemic threshold for these benefits to have in order for you to be entitled to stay steadfast about P for some time period T in the face of disagreement? I also think that more work is needed on other aspects of Elgin's overall model, right? This was about the threshold for adequacy. This is about the threshold for the views being eligible for this anti-revisionism in the first place. Just how much does some argument for P have to have going for it in order for you to be able to get the license from Elgin? What exactly counts as an epistemic benefit? She actually doesn't say a whole lot in her paper about this, right? The sort of hazy thought is that your community will somehow or other benefit. Maybe by clarifying the issue and having longer debates, more protracted debates, you'll ultimately get to the truth of the issue. Of course, that doesn't always happen, we know that, but what would it take for that kind of situation to be an epistemic benefit? Or maybe you want to say net epistemic benefit. You might have been thinking about this as well. We've sort of been imagining this idealized situation where there are these, I don't know, discrete epistemic communities, but of course it doesn't take a whole lot of philosophy to know that it's very difficult to demarcate the boundaries of one community, right? We're a community of inquirers right here in this room today, but of course there are lots of other communities. And I wondered just yesterday whether her view could handle the fact, because it seems to be a fact, doesn't it? That we are members at the same time in multiple epistemic communities. And what if, couldn't it happen, right? What if a situation arises where remaining steadfast about P for some time, you have some reason to think is going to benefit this one community you're part of, but maybe it's also going to harm the other community that you're also part of, right? We're communities of philosophers, we're communities of parents and neighbors and you know, human beings and all sorts of other things, right? So there might be some worries there. And what about disagreements about the rationality of remaining steadfast, right? So if Elgin says, or if someone who's persuaded by Elgin's view says, it's okay for me on this occasion to remain steadfast in the face of disagreement because I have at least some reason to think that benefits will accrue, and then somebody disagrees about that, well, what community is that person now a member of? Is there this new thing happening where you've got the second order disagreement and there's a community of inquirers there? Things are going to get, I think, very complicated very quickly. That's just, you know, philosophy, right? That's just kind of I don't know, quibbling or raising some perhaps obvious questions. But let me close with a couple of more positive points. I think that Lackey and King are right, as I've said, to broaden the scope of this debate. It's not just this pure issue of disagreement between perfect epistemic peers who've looked at all the evidence perfectly and who are exactly rational and so forth. I think the issue is a live one in our lives. I think we act as though it's a real issue in our lives. And I think it's worthwhile that they're trying to broaden the terms of this debate. And I actually quite welcome Elgin's attempt to focus on the social dimension to knowledge, because a lot of this literature doesn't. And I think it's an important and fruitful dimension, even if there is much work left to be done. That's it. Thank you very much.